Do you have a higher mileage N55 and you're scared to death of a rod blowing out the bottom of the engine block and rod knock and all those other terrifying noises? Are you like Will Ferrell?
I'm so scared right now, you shut up!
Well, hopefully, after watching this video, you won't be as scared anymore. There's a lot of chatter these days about the N55 engine and rod bearings and how long they last. Truth be told, we have absolutely no idea what the rod bearing conditions are in this engine. There's no Blackstone oil analysis that shows a sign of rod bearing wear. However, the owner of this vehicle, who works here at FCP Euro, recently had a bunch of work done on this car, including a pure Stage 2 turbo upgrade along with a tune, and he plans on running this car at Impact this August, and he wants the engine to be as good condition as possible. We know that has an oil pan leak, so while we're in there doing the oil pan gasket, it probably makes sense to go just a little bit further and swap out the rod bearings, which is not that much additional work. So with that said, here's all the parts we're going to be using to do this job. We need to lower the subframe, we need to disconnect the front suspension and a lot of the steering components, so we have all the hardware associated with that. Replacement oil pan gasket, all of the suction tube slash windage tray. This is what this is right here. We'll be replacing this at the same time, which is generally a good idea to do anyway, since it is plastic and it could suffer from micro cracks, which on its own could be a source of problems for rod bearing wear. And along with that, we'll be installing ACL rod bearings along with the OEM rod bolts. Now, with that said, let's talk about some of the tools we're going to need to do this job, and then we can go ahead and jump right into it. All right, so some of the tools you need for this job. First and foremost, you definitely need a way to support the engine. So whether it's an engine support bar, engine hoist, blocks of wood, it doesn't really matter. You need to figure out how to handle that first. But outside of that specialty tool, some of the requirements you're going to need, kind of traditional modern BMW things. You need everything from a T20, T25, T30, and a T45 and a T60 torque socket. You're going to need E10, E12, E14, and E18 external torque sockets. And then your traditional 6 points are going to range everywhere from 8mm, 10mm, 13mm, 16mm, 18mm, 21mm, 19mm as well, and a 22mm socket. And then past that, torque wrenches that could do a torque spec as low as 4 Newton meters, and then torque specs that go upwards of 100 Newton meters, and a ton of torque to angle fasteners. So if you have a torque angle gauge, you need to do something up to 180 degrees of rotation, so have that in mind. You want a 14mm 12-point spark plug socket, and then your variety of other tools to help you along the way, such as a dead blow hammer, impact tools and electric tools, a oil filter cap wrench, which pretty much assume you're going to take on this job yourself. You probably already have, but that's an 86mm 16 flute. And then highly recommend having the tool to keep the hood in the supported position while you're doing all this work as well. So first and foremost, we need to do a bunch of work up top here on the engine bay. Hood's propped, so we have this hood lift support lock in place just to make sure if one of the hood struts somehow fails, it won't come crashing down on us, so safety first. Secondly, we're going to be disconnecting the fuel injectors, the electrical connectors, and removing the spark plugs, because at the end of this, we do need to prime the engine, and it is important to do that without the engine starting. So the fuel injectors being disconnected is going to make sure fuel doesn't get in there. And also the spark plugs being out of the engine's going to crank a lot easier. So just a good idea to do both, but in order to get to that point, you got to take the air box off, our suction cowl, the engine cover. Now, of course, on this vehicle, the back portion of the cowl is missing, which is a very common thing on a lot of tuned cars, E90s and E80s, simply since it gives you better access to the rear. So don't have to worry about that. But we're going to start up here. T20 to get these torque screws out. All right, next up, we will disconnect the mass airflow sensor. So the little electrical connector is here. Just push down that release here and you'll pull it off. They've been on there for a while. Could be a little bit stubborn to remove, but just be patient. I'll also pop off this forward beauty cover. It's so beautiful. Next up, we're going to take a 6mm hose clamp driver. Of course, you can use a flathead screwdriver on these clamps as well, but the hose clamp driver is just as convenient. And we'll loosen that clamp there so we can pull the air box off. Pull this boot back. And then the airbox is held in on a couple of grommets. You need to make sure that nothing is attached to it. For example, this bracket back here. So we have a battery cable and some of the engine wiring harness. We'll just pull these off like so, because this bracket is going to come with it. And then we'll just lift this out of place. And then from here we have this silencer or acoustic covering. It's to reduce injector noise. It's kind of held in. Gotta remove these pieces here. So while trying to remove this acoustic cover, notice that our part of our V-brace is actually loose. They're both loose. So we're gonna have to fix that. That's not related to DIY. Well, actually, we'll make it related to DIY. Sometimes while doing a job, you'll find other problems. Now's the time to take care of it. But that said, this V-brace does need to come out. And also having this out is gonna make it easier to set up the engine support bar. And we have this Torx bolt right here. And that is definitely loose. And our V-brace bolt is an E18. We'll definitely make sure that one is torqued to spec when we put it back in this time, because I'm sure this is probably making some rattling noises. And then we have E14s here at the strut towers. Those were tight. Plastic, lots of plastic. So now at this point we're going to start removing our ignition coils. And again, the reason why we're going to remove the spark plugs is anytime you do a major service on any of these engines, oil pan gasket, oil filter housing gasket, oil pump replacement, Vano sprockets, anything that involves a lubrication system outside of an oil change, the recommendation is to prime the engine, which is to crank the engine 3 times for 10 seconds to completely flush any air out of the oiling galley. That service bulletin for BMW applies to all engines. However, it did originate from N55s dying shortly after pretty common repairs. And the N55 is unique in the respect that it has a very simplified oiling circuit compared to the N52 and the N54. So a lot less oil volume in the oil galley. And it is my belief that that simplification, while it makes the Vano system more reliable compared to the N52 and N54, it does have the Achilles heel. If there's air trapped in there, it does take a little bit longer for that to get out. So BMW has a service bulletin. They apply it to all engines. It's really not a bad idea to do it anyway, but it really stems from the N55. And so we will follow that procedure. And I'd rather crank the engine freely with the spark plugs out. Make it a little bit easier on the starter. And then of course we got this great O2 sensor bracket back here. So I'm gonna take this bracket out. It's a T27 screw. That bracket holds on to the O2 sensor connectors. And that's all to get to number 5. Talked about this in other videos too. Sometimes these coils can be kind of stubborn to remove. So I like to take a flathead screwdriver, put the flathead through the connector lock, and then pull up. Just gives you a little bit more leverage. And before I pull the spark plugs out, I'm just going to disconnect our injector connectors here. This is to make sure that the injectors don't fire when we crank the engine. So you have a little release tab that we have to push forward, and then the connector pops out. So you can see this little ear right there. All you're doing on the injector is you're pushing that forward with a pick. We'll just go down the line and do them all. And now I'll go ahead and remove the spark plugs. So these are 14 millimeter 12 point. There's a special spark plug socket for that. which we offer here at FCP Euro. This one happens to be the Beirut style socket, which has the magnetic holder inside of it, which I prefer personally. And we're going to be doing quite a bit of work here with these spark plug tubes open. So I'm just taking some lint-free shop towels here. I'm just going to plug the holes off. If you have any plastic or rubber caps, I'll do the same thing. But I just don't want, you know, a bolt or a screw or something else falling down. So next up, we do need to get this fan out of the way since we need access to the front of the engine. But we also need to drain the oil, and there are some attachments down below that are on the fan. So I'm going to loosen our oil filter housing cap first, just a little bit, just a skosh. And then we're going to take the cap, or our oil filter cap, and loosen that. And then we'll lift the car up, drain the oil. That'll kind of help it drain out a little bit faster. And then we'll take the splash shield off below, remove the items that are attached to the fan from below. Once the oil finishes draining, we'll lower it back down, then we'll pull the fan out. So this car has an aluminum under tray on it as opposed to the factory plastic or felt one. The factory one is going to be held on by a bunch of 8mm screws. This one is held on by 4mm Allens. So depending on what your car has, it might vary, but we just need access to the oil pan drain plug, which is back here. And we got a little leaf, a little foliage, and I can already see the leak. So we do in fact have a leaking oil pan. And you know, I just realized I did all that to gain access to the drain plug, but I need to take this entire thing off anyway. So that was pointless. We're just gonna remove all the screws and remove the aluminum tray. And we got a couple drips, so we'll take this off to the side. All right, oil pan leak confirmed, which not really that surprising. So we're gonna go ahead and drain the oil. It's a 17mm for the drain plug. Pretty typical BMW size right there. So we could definitely sit here all day and let the oil continue to drain out of the oil pan, but there's no point in that because, well, we're dropping it anyway. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the drain plug back on with the new crush washer that's in the MAN oil filter kit. Replace the crush washer, that is a very important thing. Torque spec on this drain plug is 25 Newton meters, and we can just take care of this now. First new part installed. So this is the screw right here that holds our trans cooler to the fan shroud. This would only apply to vehicles that have the dual clutch transmission. So that is a T27. Ironically enough, a 4mm Allen also fits in there, but pretty sure it's a T27. So we'll take that screw out now. And then that'll allow us to freely pull up our fan shroud. I'm gonna take a look, make sure there's nothing else holding it in down here, but that should be it. Should be able to get everything else up from the top. So now we're back up top. We still need to pull the fan out, but we're gonna put a brand new oil filter in. We're just gonna do it now. Makes sense. We'll tighten our cap again, and then we'll pull the oil filter out. This is one of the special sockets that we offer to remove the oil filter cap or factory style oil filter caps off these engines. It's an 86mm 16 flute. Please don't use adjustable pliers or something like that on this because you'll just damage the cap and break it. There's always a little bit of residual oil left over, so we'll just pull this up straight. That'll drain back into the engine. We're using the MAN oil filter kit, the classic HU816X. Fits the N52, N54, N55 engine, N20s. And it does come with the proper O-rings and also the drain plug crush washer. So very important to install the O-rings in the correct position. Number one, this right here, that should always have an O-ring on it. Also, the cage should be present inside the oil filter housing cap. Plenty of engines have failed because somebody has broken this or failed to put it back in. This is actually the drain back block for the oil filter housing. So if we look inside here, that hole right there in the center is for the drain back for the oil filter housing back into the engine. That's so when you remove the cap, any excess oil can drain into it. If that hole is not plugged, you will have an oil pressure problem and the engine will slowly kill itself. So always replace his O-ring, always make sure the O-ring is installed, and make sure that the filter cage is installed, like so. And then the proper position for this O-ring is this groove right here. A lot of people have put it all the way up against the bottom flange of this housing. That is the incorrect location. Will cause oil leaks in most cases, but the correct position is right there. The O-ring will simply roll into position. There's no need to force it past that. So when you're all done, it should look exactly like this. We'll use some of that residual oil to lubricate the O-ring and we will reinstall it. Of course, we will clean that cap. And just like a spin-on filter, you can thread this in by hand, and usually where it bottoms out, you don't need to go any further. Now, the torque spec, it's on the cap, says 25 Newton meters. The question is by hand, did I get the 25 Newton meters? Let's see. Pretty close. Didn't really move that much, but the point is, these things do not have to be tight. You just need it bottomed out, and is that O-ring, the black one, that's what provides the seal. Sometimes these wrenches can get stuck on, so just tap it with the socket, comes right off, or your ratchet rather. Now that we've accomplished that, let's get the fan out. First and foremost, we'll remove our connector here. There's two locks. There's one on the bottom, there's one here on the top. That one on the bottom is in a kind of a annoying place. So I'm just gonna use a little pry tool here to push against it, so I can't really get my finger in there. There we go. We'll put the connector kind of over here to the side. And then we have our expansion tank hose, which conveniently comes over the top of the fan shroud. Not in the way at all. And we will push that off to the side. These can be brittle if they're old, so be careful. They may not have that much flexibility like this one does, and they can break easily, so just be careful. And since this is an aftermarket radiator, it's using a 10mm screw. The factory screws, if I recall correctly, it's a T30 self-tapping or a T27 self-tapping, so that's normally a Torx, but in this case it's a 10mm. And this has the CSF racing radiator in it, so it's a triple pass radiator, additional cooling. So from here we should be good to pull straight up. We'll just make sure it doesn't snag anything as it's coming up. There we go, comes right out. Just gotta make sure that these little alignment tabs are clearing as they're coming out. And then right here, that's where the transmission oil cooler bolts to from underneath. So if it has a DCT transmission, just make sure you remove that screw before you start pulling up. Otherwise, you're in for a world of hurt. Next up, I need to remove the serpentine belt. Later on, when we go to remove the oil pan, the power steering pump pulley needs to be removed in order to get bolts out of the power steering pump to then release the oil pan. So the belt needs to come out in order to do that. The tensioner is right here. We need a T60 socket, and we're gonna rotate it clockwise as you're facing the engine. That'll release the tension, and we'll be able to slide the belt off. So you'll see the little hole there in the tensioner right next to our pulley. That is where the lock from the factory is. It normally come with a pin. Now I try to keep those pins, but finding them when you need them is almost impossible. Fortunately, a 3/32 Allen bit or Allen key works perfect, and the likelihood of you coming across a 3/32 Allen on a BMW is also slim to none. I would say 0. So we can go ahead and use that with no repercussions later on. That will lock the tensioner in place so that we can just slide not only the socket out, but also get the belt out. So be prepared with that as well. So at this point, obviously, you've seen some stuff change here. So we have this support bar across the engine right now. We're using the E-chassis tow hook. We'll give you the part number for that. The tow hook that comes with your car will not thread into the cylinder heads. It's a totally different thread pitch, so you do need a different tow hook. With that said, we're using a support bar that uses 3 positions instead of the traditional 2. So depending on what support brace you're using or what method you're using to support the engine once you drop the subframe, this might look different. This is our setup. If you're using a 4-point or a 2-point, this is going to vary. With that said, this is our setup that we're choosing to use. And at this point, we're going to lift the car back up and we're going to start removing suspension components, subframe, all that good stuff. So with that said, let's get the car up in the air and let's move on. So at this point, we're going to start removing a bunch of the suspension components. I'm going to choose to unbolt the control arms from the subframe. So these 2 right here, this does have the M3 control arm upgrade, very popular on your E80, E90 chassis cars. So I'll just unbolt the control arms, those will droop down. I'm going to disconnect the tie rod from the steering knuckle, or the outer tie rod from the steering knuckle, both ends. The only difference here on the left side is we do have our headlight level sensor, which we will need to undo. Disconnect the sway bar links right here, and then that will remove the axle suspension from the subframe. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to start with the tie rod and get the nut loose first while everything is still tied together. It's going to be kind of difficult to attempt to do that if the control arm is no longer attached. So it's 22 millimeter. These lock nuts could be pretty tight, so of course the steering is moving, which is okay. I just need the nut to break free, and then I have to counter hold like so. All right. Now, these ball joints do not have a taper, so you do not need a ball joint separator or anything like that. This will spin all day unless you counter hold the stud. And I don't want the stud of the ball joint to spin because the ball seat of the ball joint has some dimples on it, which act as a locking mechanism into the aluminum knuckle. I really don't want to mar that up, so my focus is on simply getting the nut to come off the stud without the ball joint stud spinning at all. And like I said, there's no taper on these ball joints, so they just fall out. We're replacing these nuts, so I'm going to throw this in the trash. Next up, we have our sway bar link. I'm going to go disconnect that. It's a 16 millimeter nut, and we do have a counter hold here. I'm just going to hold that with some adjustable pliers. It's probably a 16 as well. All right, we're going to release the control arms from the subframe, 18 millimeter bolt for the thrust arm. The nut is encapsulated. It's a self-captured nut that slips onto the subframe. And we have an 18 millimeter bolt, 18 millimeter nut for the rearward wishbone. These bolts are torqued to yield, so we will be replacing them. And that's the self-encapsulated nut I was telling you about. Just slips onto the subframe. Again, that's one-time use as well, so these are going to just be hucked in the trash or the recycling bin, whichever. Recycling bin. Captain Planet appreciates that. So now that we've done everything that we need to do on this side, I'm literally going to go ahead and mirror everything that we just did on this end, except we don't have to worry about the weirdness with that headlight level sensor. Next up, we need to remove the banjo bolts from the steering rack because we have our high pressure line in and then we have the return line out. So we got a 22 millimeter banjo bolt and a 19 millimeter banjo bolt. We'll break those loose free. That will also partially drain our power steering system, which is part of the process anyway, because the steering rack is coming with the subframe. And we're gonna go ahead and release the 19 millimeter banjo bolt now. Do expect some fluid to come out, but not nearly as much as that larger banjo fitting. Yeah, not as much volume there. So this banjo bolt right here has a built-in check valve, as you can see. It's a sort of a drain back valve, if you will. If you track one of these cars, so road race or whatever, important to replace this with a banjo bolt that does not have the check valve in it, because if you have a curb strike with the wheels, the pressure that builds up from that could create a back pressure of the system, destroy the power steering pump as well as the end seals in the steering rack. So it's really not that necessary. Most people choose to delete this for that safety. So we could stand here all day and wait for these power steering hoses to stop dripping. I don't want to do that. So we have these little stoppers from CTA. They just simply slip onto the ends of the banjo line and it'll help reduce the mess. So just gonna slide these on. And that should allow us to stay a little bit cleaner. So what we have to do next is remove this Torx bolt here from the steering input shaft. This is going to allow for this coupler to come off the steering rack when we start to lower the subframe. Pointing to it now to show you where it is, because there's no way you're going to see that while I'm removing it. So just pointing to it for reference. And that E-Torx bolt is an E10. All right, so at this point, we are getting close to removing our subframe bolts and lowering the subframe. We do have this power steering hose, this pressure line that needs to come off the steering rack because it obviously can't come with the subframe. We also have a cooling hose up here that we need to be aware of. So that's kind of locked in place. We're gonna have to make sure that that's unhooked. And then once these hoses are loose, then we can start removing our subframe bolts. So I'm gonna start here, power steering line, 10mm nut. There we go. The actual bushing broke. I'm not surprised. They typically do, but they should come loose on their own without having to hold anything, like this one over here. So we will replace that bushing. It looked pretty petrified anyway, and not because it's scared, but old. That dad joke. So for our coolant transfer pipe that comes across the front of the subframe, it's held in place with 2 screws. I have a T27 socket on them right now, and they're coming loose. So T27 seems to be the right number. It feels like it's tight in there. It could be an Allen possibly, but we'll find out once we get out, because I actually can't really see it. Well, it's a Torx, but it's a T30, not a T27. T27 happened to work. So that's a very long screw for a very thin plastic flange. We gotta do the same thing on this side, but the water pump is not in the way. And now that plastic coolant pipe is loose. Like I said, very critical to loosen that coolant hose, because if you try to lower the subframe with that still connected, it's gonna break. And the job just got a lot harder, which you don't want. Next up, we're gonna remove the engine mount bolts. These are 13mm. Wrong way, dummy. And we will be replacing these. Also, if you're doing this job, whether it be an oil pan reseal or rod bearings or anything related to having to remove the subframe, now is a great time to take a look at the engine mounts and replace them if necessary. So we're gonna remove our center subframe bolts here. These are the E14s. I'm gonna leave the subframe bolts slightly loose, but enough for the subframe to lower down. I need to make sure that that steering shaft is gonna come out. And I don't wanna pull on the steering column while this is coming down. So I'm gonna loosen the subframe bolts a little bit, leave some threads in. Subframe's aluminum, so it's very light. I feel comfortable with it sitting on a handful of threads. I just wanna make sure everything comes loose accordingly. This rearward locating bolt for the subframe is 18mm. We'll just go ahead and pull that out entirely. And then our forward bolts are also E14. So this is at the point where you either need some kind of support for the subframe, or you bring in one of your friends, in this case, the one, the only, Michael Hidalgo. What's up, baby?
What's up, my good people?
All right. So the steering shaft is going to come off the steering rack, no problem. Went ahead and pushed up on it, and it's sliding right off the input. So now I'm just going to back these bolts out one at a time, and should be in a good place. All right, subframe is out of the way. We now have fairly clear access to the oil pan itself. However, there are several components that bolt to the oil pan, so you can't just start ripping out oil pan bolts. You need to disconnect certain things. Like, for example, the power steering pump mounts directly to the oil pan. We have the oil cooler lines of the transmission that are supported by the oil pan. We have an engine mount bracket over here. So what we need to do is remove these bolts that secure these other components in place first. And then once we do that, we have our bell housing bolts in the back for the transmission that go into the oil pan. And then once we kind of have all that stuff out of the way, then we'll start removing the oil pan bolts and get the oil pan out of the way. So first and foremost, I'm going to focus on our trans cooler lines. We have a 10 millimeter nut up here, and there's a 10 millimeter nut back here. I'm just going to get the one in front while I'm here. Obviously, we can really see the oil leak here. We're going to do a lot of cleanup on this car. And, you know, make it look nice when it's all done. And what we'll do is we'll just thread the nut back on, because it sort of, the bolt that slides into the little groove on the oil pan, which is right, I'll show you in a second. There's a little groove on the oil pan that counter holds the bolt right there. It just sort of slides out. So once you loosen it, you can just pull it down and out. All right, cooler lines are loose. And actually, while I'm here and looking at it, we could just disconnect our oil level sensor, because it's right here. I used some hose pliers just to hold onto those release tabs and walk the connector off. There's just so much debris and stuff that's caked in there, just made it difficult to press it with my hands. Next up, we'll start moving our power steering pump mount bracket bolts. So these are E12, and there's 3 of them. Power steering pump will dangle after this, but it's okay. And there it is. All right, we got 3 of these E10 bell housing bolts. These go directly into the oil pan. We have to remove them. These are not to be confused. There are some larger bolts. Those actually go into the engine block, so don't touch those. At this point, now I'm just gonna rip out every single E12 bolt that holds the oil pan to the engine bed plate. So let's have at it. Just gonna thread in these they're called oil pan snap-ups. They basically just thread into the block, or in this case, the bed plate. And we'll kind of hold everything together while I'm taking it apart. Of course, the thread pitch may not be the same, so that would be really unfortunate. All right, so on the N55 engine, the windage tray is also the oil pump pickup. You can see it's integrated all one unit. It's plastic. It is a not great design for many reasons. We're gonna be replacing this as part of the job. And also, if you're doing an oil pan gasket replacement specifically, it's not a bad idea to replace this while you're in there, strictly because if there's any kind of micro cracking in the pickup tube, think about it this way. If you ever try to drink through a straw that has a crack in it, it's next to impossible. That would be your oil pump trying to scavenge oil from the sump. So I know for a fact that some of these have suffered from micro cracking. Just like the oil pan gasket becoming extremely brittle, you have to imagine this is probably going through the same process. So if you've gone this far, it doesn't make sense to me to not replace it at the same time. But in our case, we need to pull it out just to gain access to the connecting rods. So we have a series of E10 bolts that go around the perimeter. We'll remove those, and then we'll remove it out of the way. And also expect oil to come out once you pull this. Shockingly, no oil came out. This is sealed at the oil pump with an O-ring. So you do have to rock it back and forth to get it to move out, but it's only secured in with those bolts against the bed plate there. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We do have to take the oil pump out. All right, so we need to undo our oil pump sprocket here. Now there is a special counter hold tool from BMW that sits here in the sprocket and then it butts up against the block. It's about an $80 tool, will be useful in this case. One thing to note, it is a traditional right hand thread bolt, so it's not counterclockwise or anything like that. What I'm gonna do is gonna be very methodical with my movement of this bolt, T45 by the way. I'm gonna counter hold the crankshaft of the 22 millimeter socket on a ratchet, and we'll break it free very carefully, like that. We are going to have to be careful when we tighten this back down because it's going to go against the tension side, which is over here, but we will be able to do that, no problem. And if you want to buy the special counter hold tool, part number in the description. But not 100% necessary. We'll be replacing that. And now from here, we have a series of eTorx bolts that hold our oil pump to not only to the engine block, but also to the oil pump chain guide. So we have a couple E12, looks like E10s here and E12s here. All right, we're gonna remove our E10s here first at the front. This mounts the timing guide, which is one piece assembly, with the guide rails and also the tensioner to the oil pump. So pull these bolts out. These are all replaced with new stuff. And the reason why we have to remove our oil pump here is in order to get to cylinder number 1. And then we have 1, 2, 3 E12s that hold the oil pump to the bottom of the engine block. The best way to explain what I did there is we have to get the sprocket off, and there is a little bit of tension from the oil pump chain tensioner up top. Basically was able to get enough wiggle forward out of it to slide it off, and then from there I was able to get the oil pump down and off this dowel over here and that dowel there. Unfortunately, because it has dowels, you have to get that sprocket to come off first. So I was able to do that, and when we go put it back together, we're also gonna have to get that sprocket back into position. So we'll have to find a new way to get it back down, but oil pump is out of the way, and now we have full access to all of the connecting rods on this engine.